Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating blueprint for national financial recovery found in Chapter 3 of our source text. Now, this is definitely not your standard economic white paper. We're looking at a highly unique perspective that frames a nation's massive debt through the lens of a historical corporate restructuring.
Imagine trying to fix a 900 trillion yen deficit. Let's dive into this by exploring the text's core premise, which is applying the turnaround strategies of Uesugi Yozan to modern Japan. For a little historical context here, Uesugi Yozan was a legendary Edo period leader, famous for saving his domain from the brink of absolute bankruptcy through severe austerity and economic stimulation. The source material basically channels his perspective to tackle modern Japan's staggering national debt. So, how exactly does one manage a financial crisis of that magnitude?
To answer that, here is our roadmap for this turnaround plan. 1. A warning to modern Japan. 2. The risk of relying on China. 3. No tax hike without growth. 4. Thorough administrative reform. And 5. Public-private management sense.
Just to set the stage, we're looking directly at Chapter 3 from the source text. Interestingly, this is framed as a spiritual message from Uesugi Yozan recorded back in April 2010. It's a very specific and honestly unorthodox critique of the political climate at the time, offering a pretty radical roadmap out of the crisis.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, a warning to modern Japan.
The text really doesn't pull any punches here. It takes a hard look at the 2010 government led by the Democratic Party of Japan at the time and heavily criticizes their focus on what it calls socialist-style handouts. The core argument? You can't just distribute money without actually creating new wealth. It's fundamentally flawed. The author insists that leadership has to prioritize actual value creation, exactly like a business focusing on real revenue instead of just burning through its capital.
So what did this mismanagement look like, according to the source? Well, things like child allowances are called out as just shallow vote-gathering tactics that completely missed a long-term operational strategy. On top of that, the text points out major foreign policy blind spots, specifically citing naive approaches to the Okinawa base relocation and being totally unprepared for North Korean missile threats. Basically, from this perspective, the government was failing at running Japan Inc., both domestically and abroad.
Moving right along to Section 2, the risk of relying on China.
This number right here, 10, is a huge deal in the text. The source emphasizes that China's population is roughly 10 times that of Japan. Why does that matter so much? Because trying to compete in a pure manufacturing volume war or competing on cheap labor is mathematically and practically impossible. It's just a losing game for a much smaller population. And the source gives a really blunt warning about this. It characterizes the Chinese economy of that era as a highly unstable, military-driven bubble. The author is absolutely adamant here. This bubble will inevitably collapse. So tethering Japan's economic recovery to China's growth? The text argues that is incredibly dangerous. The solution, according to this blueprint, is a massive pivot. Japan has to stop relying on external forces and hyper-evolve its own high-value-added domestic industries to survive. We're talking about innovating so much that you create technological or service monopolies, things that a massive neighbor simply can't copy or outscale.
Which brings us to Section 3, and arguably the biggest takeaway here. No tax hike without growth.
If you remember one thing from this explainer, make it this economic principle. No tax increase without economic growth. The author is super clear on this. Raising taxes on an economy that is already struggling and stagnant, the text claims that will absolutely kill the nation's financial future. It's like trying to squeeze more juice from a totally dried up lemon. You have to grow the lemon first.
The text basically says the government has the fundamental order completely backward. When you're staring down a 900 trillion yen deficit, the state has to act like a turnaround CEO. A failing company doesn't survive by just jacking up prices on its exhausted customers, right? It survives by cutting the fat, innovating, and stimulating new growth. According to the source, only after the economy is actually growing and citizens are wealthier should the government even consider discussing tax increases.
So how do you actually execute that? That brings us to Section 4, thorough administrative reform.
Before any tax talks can happen, the source demands some seriously ruthless administrative reform. The text views the bureaucracy as a bloated, incompetent system that actively hinders recovery. The fixes are highly specific. drastically cut civil service jobs, crush any internal resistance or sabotage against efficiency, demand private sector levels of productivity from public workers, and aggressively privatize any public sectors that are bleeding taxpayer money. The author also zeroes in on a very specific target here: public interest corporations. The proposal is to strip away their tax-exempt status if they are turning a profit. The logic is pretty straightforward. If you're operating like a business and making money like a business, you should be treated and taxed exactly like a private business so you can contribute to the national recovery.
Finally, we hit Section 5, Public-Private Management Sense. To make all these reforms actually stick, the text calls for a massive mindset shift. It says civil servants desperately need an entrepreneurial spirit. Instead of just mindlessly administering existing budgets, the government should actively build profit-generating departments. The source even suggests sending bureaucrats out to work at startups or venture capital firms to learn how to take calculated risks and generate wealth. It completely flips the traditional script.
And this mindset has to start at the top, locally too. The text argues that mayors and governors absolutely must possess real business talent. It envisions a world where regions stop passively relying on national tax handouts. Instead, local leaders need to step up like branch managers, actively competing, generating local wealth, attracting new industries, and revitalizing their own specific regions using smart business practices. To wrap up today's explainer, the source leaves us with a really provocative premise to ponder. We've just looked at a blueprint that demands we treat a 900 trillion yen national debt exactly like a corporate bankruptcy, demanding growth before taxes, ruthless efficiency, and a totally entrepreneurial takeover of the public sector. So what do you think? Can a nation truly be saved by managing it exactly like a struggling enterprise? It's definitely a fascinating lens for national economics and one that absolutely challenges the traditional political playbook. Thanks so much for joining me today as we unpack this source material.